magazine, Snap Judgment. Here's how the format works. Our subscribers and patrons have submitted the first page of their genre short stories or novels, up to 250 words. As I'm reading the submission, if at any point our editors feel they would stop reading and reject the piece, they raise their hand. If all three hands are raised, I stop reading and our editors give their feedback. The judges' critiques are meant to help you own your craft and to answer that age-old question of, what is a magazine editor really looking for? We receive more stories than we can cover in 90 minutes, so your entries have been randomized, and we will go in the order that fate has set. My apologies, we don't get to your work. I'm Andrea Johnson, and I'm your narrator today. Please join me in welcoming our judges. We have Lesley Conner, Apex Magazine's editor-in-chief and author of the alternate history extreme horror novel, The Wake of Change. Rebecca E. Treasure, managing editor and flash editor of Apex Magazine and a writer with short fiction in Galaxy's Edge, Air and Nothingness Press, and others. And our special guest, Vajra Chandrasekera from Colombo, Sri Lanka. His debut novel, The Saint of Bright Doors, won the Locus, Nebula, and Crawford Awards, and was a New York Times Notable Book of 2023. His second novel, Rakesfall, is out now. But before we start the show, we have a special reminder. Apex is currently running its Kickstarter to fund the magazine for 2025. So if you enjoy this show and the magazine, please consider supporting the Apex Magazine 2025 Kickstarter. We have great reward tiers and add-ons, from subscriptions to anthology bundles and personal critiques. You can even buy a personal Snap Judgment. Leslie, Rebecca, and Snap Judgment favorite Nick Mamatas will react to the first 2 pages of your short story or novel in our usual show format. We'll then send you a personal video file of your own Snap Judgment. As with our regular series, your name will be kept anonymous from our judges. You can find the link to the Kickstarter in the YouTube description below. Judges, are you ready? Let's go. Our first submission is titled, As We Cease to Be Remembered, We Cease to Exist, and the genre is dark speculative fiction short story. I follow Karen over field and through river and come out on the other side, bereft of body but rich in death. I emerge in a beautiful, limpid place, a mockery of the world I've come from, but attractive all the same. Lush trees surround me, their trunks and foliage stunning in purples and greens, but oddly faint, like their creator watered down the paint to preserve its longevity. An oil painting misremembered as watercolor. Drifting shadows pass in my periphery, taking the rough shapes of humans, but wisping away if I try to examine them too closely. They are innumerable, oppressive. One passes close, too close, a limb or a tendril reaching out almost near enough to touch me. The cold breeze it leaves behind makes me ill. I lean against a tree and feel the urge to throw up. I do throw up, I think, or try to. I go through the motions, retching noiselessly, but nothing comes out. My throat feels great to bear. Straightening up, my eyes find the tree line and I decide I need to press on to ignore the threats of people unseen. I don't look down at myself, I can't. There's a looming dread inside that I may look as they do, spectral and forgotten. I know that I'm dead, but I'm not prepared to be lost. If I ignore the penumbra amidst the trees, which is difficult to do, I am alone here. Rebecca, let's start with you.
Okay. I love a lot of the language through here. I think especially the oil painting watercolor, that was a really beautiful way to describe the colors there. I feel like there's a lot of description here, and this is, it says short story, and this is a lot of setting and vibe and mood, but I don't know who I am in this piece. I'm lacking a character to latch onto, and that's making it hard for me to be invested in any of these things. It says, I decide I need to press on, and I'm like, but why? I have no idea what your goal is, what you want, what you're interested in. We have Karen, we know that they know that they're dead. But I feel like there's some narrative thrust that my hand didn't go up because the language is really lovely, but I was kind of hoping for more like, all right, but why am I invested in this? Where is this going? If this was a novel opening, I think I would have been more patient with it, but with a short story, we typically want to get moving a little bit faster.
I completely agree. I mean, the very first, like, I'm taking notes while you're reading, and the very first thing that I wrote was like, it was a lovely first sentence. I really liked the first sentence. It was nice. It grabbed me, and it's full of lovely description. But by the third paragraph, I was starting to look for a reason, a plot. Like right now, we're just getting the description, and it's beautiful. It's very well written, but you do. I kind of at the very end was like, do I put my hand up or not? Because if something didn't happen soon to make me understand why we should care about this character or what the thrust of the story is going to be, then I would pass. Like, beautiful descriptions are only going to get you so far before you really have to have like a solid plot, like a reason why this story is being written. We have to get there. So yeah, I completely agree with Becky. The descriptions are very lovely. They're very, very well done. You just really maybe need to kind of break all of that setting up with giving us little crumbs of what the plot's going to be.
Vajra, how about you?
I liked this. I would have kept reading it. I liked the language. I liked the opening sentence. I didn't like the 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 necessity of the narrative surroundings being vague and kind of ghostly and watered down, because it makes that hard to describe. But the story compensated for that by giving the narrator an embodied physical reaction of the throwing up. So that was good. That was a good way of handling the problem. And I think it did a good job of leaving little hooks in. So, like for example, this mention of the penumbra at the end. So there's something is about to happen in the next on the next page. So I would have kept going to find out what the penumbra was, what that means, and so forth. I think my biggest problem for this was the title sort of gives away the whole plot here. As we cease to be remembered, we cease to exist. If that's I would hope there's something more. I would be reading the next page and the following pages, hoping that there was something more to it than we are the dead, and as we cease to be remembered, we cease to exist. If that was all there was to it, I don't think I would have said yes to the story. Right? I would hope that there's another layer to it, something unexpected, and not just about the dead and memory, because you've already established that with your title itself. Your title, if that's all there is to it, then your title gives away way too much. But yeah, other than that, I would have definitely kept reading this until I hit something that changed my mind.
All right, fantastic. Are we ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Excellent. The next submission is titled The Dog Woman, and the genre is magical realism short story. The dog woman stood outside her metal gate in house slippers and a shapeless floral dress. Hanging from the corner of her mouth a lit cigarillo. She might have been mistaken for a houseworker had she not worn impractically thick beaded jewelry. The kids at school told stories about her, that she had so many dogs because she would breed them for meals, that she used to live with her family before a slighted Mankukulam turned them all into dogs, or she was the Manga Kulam who turned people into dogs. My Kuya said the dog woman was just lonely. One time I saw the dog woman walking with two mutts, one patchy-haired dog and the other cream-colored and saggy. They tugged on their ropes, pulling her arms in opposite directions, shaping her into a strange crucifixion. She had an impassive expression, waiting for the dog on the left to do its business and for the dog on the right to calm down. Hasn't your mother ever told you it's impolite to stare? She said. My entire face heated up. I ran for the nearest cover. A mango tree with mounds of black garbage bags. I don't know, I guess I thought she would tell her dogs to eat me or turn me into a dog. I crouched low and felt my leg swish against something wet. It smelled like toilet water and rotten fruit. My father is a judge, I called out. The dog woman burst into laughter. He tell you to say that? Lesley, let's start with you.
I like this one. This is a very intriguing opening. Because first of all, just from the title, Dog Woman, my mind, I'm going like, do you mean literally like a woman who is also a dog? But you then explain that this is more of a name, like the neighborhood children have come for this woman, and they have lots of theories about why why they're calling her that. I really, really enjoyed that. I thought this was very rich in detail. I think that this set this up. You give us two very clear characters right from the onset, the dog woman herself and this child. And I'm very interested to see how they're going to interact beyond this moment of the kid staring and her confronting him. So I think that that's set up really well. Overall, I think this is very good. I really enjoyed it.
Vajra, how about you?
I agree completely. Yeah, I love this. This is funny. It's visual. It has a lot of great little clever bits. I love the dogs pulling the dog woman's arms in opposite directions like a crucifixion. That was hilarious. This is great. I would have absolutely read this to the end. Been rooting for it the whole way.
And Rebecca, how about you?
I thirded. I absolutely love this. We quite often on here, we talk about a lack of specificity, and this is kind of a masterclass in the kind of specificity that we're talking about, like shapeless floral dress and house slippers. You know exactly what that looks like. And it's like, picture the rabbit in the cage. Like, it doesn't matter if it's not the same exact rabbit. We're all picturing basically the same thing. This is also a great example of like, there's no quote unquote inciting incident on this page, and there's no like clear conflict or problem, but there's clearly, this is going someplace. It's raised a lot of questions, a lot of concerns in the reader, a lot of sympathy from the reader for both of these characters. And so it's getting the reader invested, which creates that narrative momentum because they want to turn the page, not just because that's the thing that you do, but because they're growing emotionally involved in the story. So I think this is just phenomenal.
It's also a great example of slipping in a non-English culture, an Asian culture in without having to put it in inverted commas. Like, even if you don't know that a Koya is, I think, an elder brother, right, in Tagalog. But you don't actually have to know that, because you just have to know it's somebody whose opinion this kid respects,
right,
and probably a family member. You can pick that kind of thing up from context. It works.
Yeah.
And you don't have to know what a Mam Kukulam is. It's some kind of witchcraft type figure, because the sentences make it extremely clear. And without having to put anything italics or inverted commas or have any footnotes or anything. That's very good. It's very smooth.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was done very, very well, because you're, plopping us into a culture that's different than mine. But immediately I felt like I could relate to exactly what was happening, even though I don't have the backstory of it. So it's done really well to make it very accessible to a lot of readers.
Fantastic. Let's move on to our next submission. I wanna let us get through as many of these as we can. Our next submission is titled Quag. The genre is sci-fi-ish novel. They called me Quag. Their mouths were unrefined, unable to parse the truth of my origins, and so the label. a savage from beyond the sea who could not use their primitive script, signing my life away with a simple letter X. But X was the symbol of my treasure. X for my name, my birthright, hidden beneath the Odyssey's inked into my skin. A pearl before swine. They called me cannibal, too, and accused me and my people of savagery in both thoughts and deeds. To hear the pale folk speak, you would think I had spent my childhood dining on the flesh of men and the blood of babes, that I had slain 100 by the peak of my adolescence in service to a singular pagan god, some distorted lens of their own belief in the body and blood of their savior. But the illusion of this violence was useful, because it meant I was oft given a wide berth. Menfolk and womenfolk alike would find themselves paralyzed in fear upon meeting my gaze. All I had to do was smile at them, my teeth not jagged or pointed, but a normal 32 teeth, and they would cross the road, crossing themselves and muttering their prayers. Perhaps if I had aspired to be one of their number, I would be hurt. But I did not wish to scrub my skin milky white and peel off my tattoo. I am and have always been myself. Vajra, let's start with you.
Well, this is interesting. This is so it's a Moby Dick retelling, right? From the perspective of Quag. I would be more doubtful of this, but this is a novel, you said, right? So in a novel, that does work for me. I would keep going to see what was happening. It sort of reminds me of Matt Johnson's pen, for example, like retelling like older stories, which are, from the perspective of a marginalized character kind of thing. So I'm not entirely sure what makes this sci-fi-ish. But since it's a novel, I assume we can wait a little bit to find out. So far, everything here is straight up Moby Dick. But I do like the language. I like the X, the X of the signature being the X of the map, the treasure map, and the references to my. It's been a while since I read Moby Dick, so I don't actually remember the details of Quag's tattoos and whether he actually had pointed teeth in the book or not. But I'm sure the references work. It's intriguing, and since it's a novel, I would keep going.
All right, Lesley, how about you?
I have not read Moby Dick, but I spent a large part of the beginning going, this is a reference to Moby Dick, right? Like arguing with myself internally because I haven't read that. I'm very unsure of who they are. Like it keeps referencing they do this, they think this, they cross the street. And it's just like, I get that it's whoever these menfolk and womenfolk are, but who are they? Since this is a novel, I would give it a little bit farther to kind of give me the confidence that I'm not going to have to know Moby Dick backwards and forwards to understand this novel, one. And two, that it's going to give something that's new enough that people who have read Moby Dick are going, yeah, it's exactly the same thing. So I think you really, because the readers are putting a trust in you that you're going to give them enough to understand your novel or your book without knowing the reference material. And sometimes that can be a really hard thing to do. So my biggest piece of advice would be just make sure this stands on its own, so that if you have a reader who hasn't read Moby Dick or who maybe really dislikes Moby Dick, they aren't completely either lost or turned off by that. But yeah, I was a little bit torn about whether or not to raise my hand, just because I felt very lost in the material that is presented here. But it is a novel, And so you do have a little bit more leeway to get your readers invested in your story. I would just really watch that. That's something you really need to be dialed into.
And Rebecca, how about you?
Yeah, so I have also not read Moby Dick. And I agree with Lesley that it's easy to get lost in this, but understanding that that's kind of the vibe that they're going for, that kind of 19th century voice, makes this language like elevate a little bit, because I'm like, oh, okay, so the density of it is intentional. I really like that the idea of telling that story from a different perspective, because that's like a very strong cultural myth that we have in the West. I really like that idea. So I would be interested, and I would definitely read on. If this was a short story, I would be like, I don't see a lot of setting here. Who is they? But like both Vajra and Lesley said, this is a novel, so, you know, the opening just needs to be compelling, which I think this does, because I was tempted to raise my hand based on like my confusion, but it was interesting enough that I couldn't raise my hand because I was invested in what was happening. So yeah, I think this works.
Interesting to me that a few of you said I almost raised my hand, but I was compelled to keep listening. So I find that interesting. All right, let's move on.
I will say that that line, I do not wish to scrub my skin milky white and peel off my tattoos. I am and have always been myself. That got me. Like, I think that if it had ended a different way, I would have been like, no, I'm not. I'm passing. I'm not going to keep reading. But that to me was specific enough that I was like, okay, now I kind of get the intention of the character just a little bit clearer than anything before that said. So I really loved those two lines at that end.
Fantastic. I've pulled up our next submission, which is called Whenceforth Day, and the genre is science fiction short story. October 18th, 1975, 6 a.m., Durham, New Hampshire. The oldster staggered into the dorm room and toppled onto the record albums smeared across Joey's bed. Pam gaped. Yes, she believed the stories about Whenceforth days, and yes, she'd come to Joey's full of hope and desperation for this visit, but she couldn't quite believe he was really here. His body thinner, his hair gone, his hands trembling, her brother's oldster, his future self. Joey's greeting was blunt. Figures I'd be bald. The oldster coughed a feeble laugh. Submerged under the wrinkles draining her face, her own Joey peeked out in glints and slivers. His chin dimple now a dusky ditch, more untidy than sexy, and the notched edge of his left ear, age softened to marshmallowy lump. But his nose still had a regal hook, and his right hand curled across his chest at the exact angle of her brother's. The voice was wet and rough. Not completely. I shave around the edges. You will too, I bet. He pushed himself up into a sitting position. His gaze wandered over the album jackets on the bed and the grungy laundry on the floor, paused on the baggies pot arranged on the desk like a shrine before skimming across the hamster cage and over her. Ah, Pamela is here, he said formally, as if they weren't close family. Which she supposed they weren't. Not really, though genetically they absolutely were. She needed this oldster, no matter how decrepit he was. Rebecca, I'll pick on you first.
All right. There's a lot here I like. I really like wrinkles draining his face. I thought that was a really interesting description. I like dimple now a dusky ditch, but that paragraph for me started to feel lengthy and a little bit redundant. Like, we get it, he's older now. And while each individual description, I think, works fairly well, I started to feel like for a short story, I wonder if picking one or two of those stronger ones to evoke the character might have kept the pacing moving a little bit more quickly through there. But they're all good, so I can see why that would be difficult to do. And then we get to Pamela's here, and then we have as if they weren't close family, which she supposed they weren't, which is a reversal, which can work, and then they absolutely were. And so there's a little in that part, I was kind of like, well, how does she feel? She needs him, but does she care about this person? And so I found that a little bit confusing, that kind of back and forth of the character, without any understanding of what the real relationship was. I typically don't want to be confused at the beginning of the story. I want to be intrigued. And so like that threw me out a little bit. And one kind of nitpicky thing, but when the story is called Whenceforth Day, and then in the second paragraph we have Whenceforth Days, and I was like, wait, which one is it? And it made me kind of pop out of the story, just like intellectually just going, wait, which one is it? Which at the beginning of a story, you want to be pulling the reader deeper in. But overall, I think this has a lot going for it.
And Vajra, I think I may have seen your hand raised earlier.
Yeah, I think I tapped out at more untidy than sexy, because these are siblings, right? They're at least not it. I don't know, maybe the story goes into a whole like, oh, they're genetically related, but they're not really close family. Therefore, the sister thinks her brother is sexy or whatever. But it seemed okay. So this kind of story is a gimmick story, right? There's something called a Whenceforth Day, when an older version of somebody comes back and presumably gives you advice about your life or something on those lines. So that's the gimmick. The gimmick was just around that point, I realized it was just not working for me. And I think that is very much a question of like these things, it's going to land for you or it doesn't. It's not that I don't object to stories of this type in general or anything. It's just that this one, it seemed too packed, so the two, like we're deep into describing this, but there's, and into describing how the Whenceforth Day is like taking place, but I'm still unconvinced that whether I buy the Whenceforth Day in the first place. You know, the old the disbelief combined with the taking it as a given. Like you can't have it both ways. I think like if you believe the stories about the Whenceforth Days, then the sheer amount of like the way you respond to something like that actually happening should reflect the belief you allegedly have. Whereas I think this person is reacting more like someone who has never heard of what a Whenceforth Day is. So yeah, that was when I was like, the gimmick isn't landing for me.
Yeah, I kind of feel that way too. The very end where it says she needed this oldster no matter how decrepit he was, I kind of feel like we need to know earlier why she needs this older version of her brother. And also, I'm also it's saying she believed the stories about Whenceforth Day. Okay, but if you have an actual physical person there, why is it just stories, right? Like you would feel like there would be physical evidence. So even if you've never experienced it yourself, there's unrefutable evidence that yes, this is a thing that happens. So I don't know that I buy that it's just stories. And yeah, I really feel like how did Joey know that his oldster is coming back? I just feel like this opening opens up a whole lot of questions, like how does Winsford Days work? Like, how did Joey understand? Why does Pamela need this guy so badly when she may or may not feel close to her brother? There's just a whole lot of questions that I'm not sure you can answer within a short story, if that makes sense. Sometimes within a short story, you really have to kind of like narrow down how many possibilities and how many questions you're opening up, because if you open up all of these questions and all of these mechanics on like how do these things work, it can be really difficult to hold a coherent plot thread and satisfactorily answer all of those questions, which can leave the reader at the end of the story kind of feeling like, why did I read all of this if you're not going to answer all of these questions? So right at this point, I would keep reading, but I would need some questions to kind of like start being answered relatively soon, just because it does feel a little bit like you're opening up a whole bunch of doors, and I'm as a reader, I'm not sure I have the confidence that you're going to be answering those questions. So if you answer a couple of them, then I can be like, okay, now I'm in this world. I understand Pamela's motivation, and her desire, her need. I'm ready to go with you and suspend the rest of these questions that my mind is asking. So yeah, you need to kind of like give us a few answers so that we'll believe that we're going to get the rest of those answers.
Very good feedback. Thank you. I got everybody that round, didn't I? Everybody got?
Yep.
Our next submission is called God's Bounty, and it is an urban fantasy novel. Silos stood at the end of the alley, his back to the street, and drew out his plan. A smile began to crest along his lips, and he stifled it only just in time. There it is. There's that terrified look I love. Silos had to be careful not to laugh during these moments. He was supposed to be a professional, after all. The old mage, his back to the grime-covered brick wall, was whispering to himself where Silos had cornered him, foolishly trying to call on his source, his coward eyes wide with an ever-increasing panic. Why shouldn't I, though? That look gets funnier every time I see it. Rat in a trap, an animal. That's what they really were, after all, every last one. Silos did laugh then and saw the terror deepen in that bastard's stupid face. Having some trouble finding it today, are you? Silos said. Silos undid the latch on his pack, let Harry out at last. The white cat climbed out in his usual silky, smooth saunter. Slunk down Silos' side, slipping through his legs before sitting down and promptly licking himself inappropriately. Damn cat. The emerald green roostone dangled from his red collar as he cleaned himself on the filthy alleyway concrete. The mage's eyes fell on that stone, and his shoulders sunk, knowing what it was for. Please, the mage said, falling to his knees, his hands on the street like a common beggar. Not the clamps. Vajra, let's start with you.
I think this one just didn't work for me because of the protagonist's voice. It's very his coward eyes, bastard stupid face. There's a kind of casualness to this that I don't feel like I'm getting deep interiority from this person. I don't feel like I'm getting a very shallow kind of perspective of him. It's from him about like very if there are deeper motivations or if there's something more going on than just sadism, for example, I'm not saying it. And I cannot really imagine following this character, assuming this is the protagonist of the book, uh, throughout a whole novel. So I think I would probably be tapping out like after like a page or two if the story didn't genuinely go somewhere deeper, either deeper into interiority. Like I say, this can be an interesting protagonist if there's something going on, but I can't tell if this is supposed to be funny or creepy or both. And it's not really landing for me on either front.
All right, Lesley, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. Urban fantasy is hard for me. Like I knew the moment it said that the genre was urban fantasy that I would have biases against it because that's not my favorite genre. But I really am wondering whether Silas is the protagonist that we're going to be hearing, you know, their perspective through the majority of this book, because you're creating a very unlikable character, like right from the beginning, which is fine. We had a really good conversation about likabilities and characters, and people will say, oh, well, I didn't like this book because I didn't like the character. And the fact is, it isn't that you didn't like the character, it's you're not invested in the character. And so I would be interested to see if you can take this absolute asshole of a character and make me still invested in his story. Maybe you can, and that is fantastic and amazing because it's very difficult to do, because right now from this opening, you're immediately turning your readers off to this character. And you're gonna need to give them some reason to be invested in this character relatively quickly, or most readers are going to just put the book down and be like, I didn't like that character, so I didn't like that book. Also, I'm a little bit confused. The clamps are mentioned, that he drew out the clamps very, very first sentence, right? And then he undoes the latch and lets Harry, the cat, out of the bag. So I am thinking like it's set up as if Harry is the almost like the weapon that he's going to use against this mage. But then the mage says, not the clamps, which confuses me because the clamps have been out for quite a lot of thought and back and forth in Silas's head. And the mage has been there, has, you know, you would assume seen the clamps before that point. So it just made me, I felt like it was a little bit of a bait and switch. Like you mentioned the clamps, doesn't do anything with the clamps, brings out the cat, and you think, okay, well, this cat with this thing around its neck is the weapon. But then the mage is like, oh no, the clamps. So I just kind of felt that was like a little bit of a bait and switch. And I'm not sure why that was a choice you made. And
I think the idea is that the cat and the stone around the cat's neck is suppressing the mage's magical source.
Okay, see,
I think
like
that's the idea. Yeah, but it
I
took me a
don't read
minute to figure that out. Yeah.
I don't read a lot of urban fantasy, and so that didn't occur to me. But now that you're saying that kind of makes sense, because he is laughing at the mage that the mage can't make his magic work. So if it's the cat that's suppressing the magic, that makes sense. I still just I don't, I think that I would move that, like, not the don't use the clamps, up closer to where you mentioned that he brought the clamps out.
Yeah.
How about you, Rebecca?
Yeah, people don't like you don't pull a gun on someone and then like sit there and think about what you're going to do with it for 35 seconds and then say freeze, right? Like, so if you're going to have something that's like a threat like that, typically in the real world, we act on that fairly quickly and we react to that fairly quickly. So that felt like kind of a false hook to me where you're like, ooh, what are the clamps? And then here's my whole interior exposition thing. I love urban fantasy. I read it and I've written it. And one of the things that when I sent my urban fantasy novel out to beta readers, they were like, the humor that you're trying for in the opening chapter feels kind of slapstick because you're trying to show like, ooh, this is urban fantasy and this is funny and I'm going to make you laugh. But they were like, no, the snark is what makes urban fantasy funny. Like the sarcasm, the raw, voice of the characters is what makes urban fantasy funny, not cats licking themselves inappropriately, or in my case, a naked man running through a town, right? Like this kind of gimmicky humor. We want to show that we're going to be funny and that this is going to be a lighthearted kind of novel, but that doesn't really feel like urban fantasy to the reader. And I took the naked man out of my book. And so that's when I raised my hand, because then it stopped feeling like urban fantasy to me at that beat. I do wonder with the unlikability of this main character, if this is a prologue. We don't know if this is chapter 1 or a prologue. This could be our main antagonist, in which case we're getting like a view into like how nasty this guy is. And if it said prologue, we would have been viewing this character through a very different kind of lens. And so that's something to consider. But even if this is your prologue and this is your antagonist, sympathetic antagonists are more interesting and more challenging for readers than just bad guys, right? Somebody who is mean to the cat and mean to the guy and is just laughing at everybody's misfortunes. Everybody hates that. But if you can draw your reader into some kind of moral dilemma of like, well, but he kind of has a point, like Thanos, like, oh, well, I kind of feel bad for him. He kind of has a point, or you have to like think about what the bad guy is doing and feeling. So even if this is a prologue, I would still look at that interiority that Vajra mentioned and try to draw the reader deeper into this perspective and force them to have sympathy for it.
You're absolutely correct. Like most villains, really good villains, they don't think of themselves as a villain. Like they're not like, wahaha, I'm evil for the sake of being evil. Like they're doing something because it matches up what they think needs to be done. And right now, Silas very much feels like, ha ha ha, I'm bad just to be bad. Look how bad I'm being. So I would maybe like, and that would be the part that if he is the protagonist, if he has a reason, like if this badness in his mind isn't bad because of something very interesting, that might give us the interesting part to keep reading, where people aren't just going to be like, 1 star, I didn't like the character. So just something to keep in mind.
All right, let's go to our next submission. Our next submission is titled God Teeth, and the genre is secondary world, cosmic horror novel. This would all be over soon. A few more steps. This would all be over soon. Just a few more steps. This would all be over soon. Just a few more steps. She had to get Luahi home. Hey, funny girl. Hey, everything will be okay. Nohia couldn't force the lyrics out from chattering teeth. The forest was cold, too cold, and so was her sister. The 2-year-old shivered softly in her arms, but gave no other signs of life. Just hours ago, Luahi's eyes had been sun-bright as midday obsidian. Now they were the same empty dark as what lurked behind the stars. No, now they were the same empty dark as what lurked behind the eyes of the children she had left behind. Left behind, not abandoned. Abandoned meant she was never going to come back, and she was going to come back. When she did, she wouldn't be just one lonely 10-year-old against the cold-eyed woman and her legion of monsters. Nohia was going to come back. Maybe even all the fighting forces of her island. Maybe even all the fighting forces of all of the islands of Nolawale. But first, she had to get out of this forest that shimmered in shades of tide and salt. First, she had to get Luahi home. Rebecca, let's start with you.
So there's a lot of descriptions in here that I found really compelling. I really like sunbright as midday obsidian and empty dark is what lurks behind the stars. Those are very kind of concrete things that I can call up into my mind and really see. I'm lacking a little bit of what that means to the character. The empty dark is what lurks behind the eyes of the children she had left behind, not abandoned. But are the children the monsters? Is the cold-eyed woman, like, there's a lot of things being layered in here that I'm not really sure how this character is feeling about, which is okay at the beginning of a novel. But there's a lot of repetition here as well. As we see with that opening, there's a lot of repetition, which is fine. It provides like the determination of the character, but my eyes, if I was reading this, would just skim. As soon as I realized it was repeating, I would just skip right to the first concrete. So it makes me wonder like what it's actually doing there if the reader is just going to skip it anyway. And then I did like shimmered in shades of tide and salt that not only is that giving us like a neat environment for the character, but that tells me something about the character and what kind of colors and experiences that they've had. So that's doing some world building, which I love when, you know, descriptions and character details start to build out the world around them that way. There's both of these characters are female. We have this girl and her sister, and we have a lot of she. And then there's a woman off screen as well. And so it's risky for me. And this is something of like a bugbear for me where I'm like, if there's more than one character of the same gender in a scene, I'm often like, okay, but use the names to provide that the reader specificity, because otherwise, if they look away because their kid comes into the room and they come back and the next sentence is just she, they may be confused about which she in the scene that's referring to, unless it's really, really clear. And so I would go over this opening for that kind of clarity and specificity, and maybe some tightening and get, you know, a little bit more grounding for the reader into this. Just one thing, it's a novel, so we don't need everything, but just something to give us a little bit more of a concrete connection to what's happening here.
And Vajra, what's your thoughts?
I agree with Becky about the repetition and about the fact that you do just skim over it when you're reading it on the page. I like this. I would keep reading it. I kind of want to know who the woman is and like what the monsters are and what happens to these kids. But I feel like the story is not exactly this section as currently arranged is not exactly like enticing me to do it. Partly because of the repetition. I don't just mean the opening lines where it repeats the same line 3 times, which I think is unnecessary. Because it simply doesn't work the way it does in when you read it aloud, right? Like you do just read it once and then skim. But there's also other repetitions. Like for example, she had to get Luahi home. That line shows up again at the end of the selection. So we've read all of this and we've got some information, but we're still kind of in the same place. And it's only at the very end of the page that we discover that she's in a forest, for example. Like all this time, we've had like we've had islands, fighting forces, legions of monsters. All of these other images have come by, have passed through before we realize that okay, these 2 kids are actually in a forest right now. I would have liked to see that first, like at the very top, like this will all be so over soon, just a few more steps. We are in a forest now with the the shades of tide and salt, and then move on to the backstory. Like ground us first and then give us the backstory. I think would work a little bit better. It's a minor tweak, but I think it would help. But overall, yes, this is it's an intriguing setup. So I would keep going, and it's a novel, so absolutely I would keep going.
And Lesley?
The repetition of the first line 3 times actually really worked for me, especially because when the third one, the few more steps is actually broken up into its own lines. To me, that immediately created a visual of slowing down. So I really like that. What I would suggest is that right after that, it says she had to get Luehi home. I would cut that, because basically that's just saying what you said in those 3 lines again. So that's where I'd be like, that's one step too far. There are other places where it is very repetitive. Like where he was going to come back. And you say that a couple of times, like, okay, say it once. You use the italics on was, so that gives it that like importance. And I think that's enough. There's a lot here that I really, really think works. I think that you're immediately putting us into this different world. I absolutely love the title, and I really want to know what God Teeth is, or what they are. I'm intrigued that you have a 10-year-old who feels as though she is the one responsible for saving all of these other children. Like, why is there not an adult who is helping this kid? So those are all things that really immediately make me invested in this child's story, because I want to know, what are they up against? Who is this woman? Why is this woman hurting kids? And why is it a child who feels like they're responsible for saving these kids? Like, to me, that's very intriguing. And that's immediately something that I'm going to be like, okay, I need to see where this goes. I would just watch the repetition. You need to trust your readers to understand when a statement is important, and like, because it's almost like if you make a statement and then you repeat it, you're pointing to it and saying, hey, this is important. But sometimes you need to trust your reader, that you're going to trust your reader, that they understand that her saying that she is going to go back, like, that's a weighty sentence, especially when you know that this character is, one, at the moment trying to save their toddler sister, and two, that this is a 10-year-old who feels like they are the ones that's responsible to go back. So we understand, without having to repeat it, that's an important statement. And I think that you just need to trust your reader just a little bit more. Other than that, I really enjoyed the opening of this. I thought it was very intriguing, and I would love to know. I think it sets up a lot of really interesting things that I'm excited to understand later.
And also on the subject of repetition, I would say watch repetition as a device, because I think this selection overuses it. You have children she had left behind, full stop, left behind, full stop, not abandoned, full stop, abandoned meant she was never going to come back, and she was going to come back. And then later on, the phrase "all the fighting forces" occurs, I think, 3 times in 3 consecutive sentences. So, and that's obviously intentional for emphasis. But I think, given that this is 1 page, right? This is the opening page, and you have like 3 or 4 different instances of repetition used for emphasis, I would say pick one.
Right,
absolutely. Pick whichever one you think is most needs to be emphasized, and use that, and then like trim the others.
All right, let's move on to our next submission, which is called After You, and the genre is a speculative fiction short story. I go into the rave inside your mind, wishing to see you there. White strobes illumine an otherwise totaled blackness. The DJ begins a new track, hands traversing the controller, pressing buttons and adjusting dials. I start to move instinctually, like I've been here before. Somewhere I have. I dance, the rhythm consuming, the bass distant yet resonant. Hazily, I notice you swaying, clearly outlined against a sea of blurs, so young and jubilant a different you. Struggling forwards, I try to reach you. I scream your name. Notice me, I beg. You can't, I know, not here. Tears kiss my cheeks, sweat envelops my arms. Neither's part of the memory, but a reaction to this remembering. Dancers come together, fusing into a monstrous assemblage of skin. Limbs snap to the pulse of an exploding track. I step backwards. Light bleeds from monochrome into multicolored, feverish glows. Industrial walls start to collapse. A buzzing somewhere. A voice, too. Emotionally overheating, memory ending. All right. Lesley, you put your hand up first, I think, so why don't you go first?
Initially, I was very intrigued by this opening sentence. I go into the rave inside your mind, wishing to see you there. But then it's like we immediately get into this description of the rave, and I feel like that could be a little bit shorter. You say rave, most readers are going to understand what you mean by rave. And the interesting part about the first sentence is that it's a rave inside your mind. And so immediately the information that I want, rather than a description of a rave, is how are you in a rave in the mind? It then becomes clear that it's a memory, but I just felt like there's too much description of this rave going on and not enough description of how this person's going into this other person's memory. Who is you? Like why are you going into a memory of, like, why is the protagonist going into this memory? Like, why is that important? And then I just kind of felt like there was a lot. Okay, so it goes, dancers come together, fusing into a monstrous assemblage of skins, limbs snap, I step backwards, lights bleed. And it's just this pace that just kind of threw me off and threw me out of the story, which might be intentional because they are getting like thrown out of the memory, but it just didn't work for me because I just already felt like you weren't giving me the information that I needed to ground me in the situation. So you're putting me in the situation. You opened it saying that you're entering a rave inside someone's mind, and then you didn't give me the information that I needed before then tossing me back out.
And Vajra, you put your hand up shortly after Lesley did.
Yeah, it was at a buzzing somewhere, which was the second or third instance of vagueness. This is actually the second story where we have a character that's surrounded by vague, hazy blurs. And I think it's a good general sort of principle. If you find yourself writing a story where your viewpoint character is surrounded by hazy, vague some things, that's a sign that you haven't thought out your surroundings yet. Get past the vagueness, figure out something concrete to put around them, and then because there's no point communicating your initial confusion as the writer of the story to the reader, right? That confusion is something for you to work through, get to something concrete, and then communicate that to the reader. That coupled with the fact that this is inside your mind, it's clearly a vision hallucination. I think a little bit later on, it turns out to be some like a tech thing, like a gadgety thing. But either way, it's not real, right? So all this drama, the lights, the dancers fusing into a monstrous assemblage of skin. That's not like this is a speculative fiction story. Are they literally turning into a giant skin monster? Yes or no? And also, does it matter, right? So the fact that this has been set into a dream or a memory, so already suggests that this is kind of like it's a special effect, but it's not really happening. None of this is actually happening, and it's not happening in the moment either. So there's actually very little drama here. Someone is just reliving something that is possibly being heightened for emotional effect, but there's no actual, nothing happening. Someone is just remembering stuff. So it's kind of like opening with a flashback, which is generally uh, kind of like something that takes the wind out of the sails of a story. Because you open with a flashback, you're already like, you're at the very beginning, you're saying, okay, well, this is not where we are right now. This is not what's happening right now. This is some backstory. So, and in a short story, that's really hard to pull off and almost always unnecessary. I would say start with something, rather than starting with the rave inside your mind, start with something else. Find some other place to start that explains who you are and why you would want to, why this person would want to go into them on somebody's mind. And then have this flashback a little later in the story as to flesh stuff out, maybe after like as a second or third scene. I think that would probably work a little better. And then all this highly kind of vivid imagery of like fusing into assemblages and exploding tracks and lights and multicolor street, all this stuff will work better if it's grounded in something, right? But right now we're getting all the visuals, but it's not grounded in anything, so it feels kind of like floaty. It just, you're just seeing all this stuff float past and it doesn't mean anything to you as a reader. So I think it might work if by that, at the time you got to it, you already knew who this person was, who the other person was, what their relationship is. So yeah, I would say just definitely do not start with the hallucinatory memory flashback.
And Rebecca, how about you?
So the first line made me think of stories where characters literally pull or have the ability to host other people in their minds. And so as the story went on and I realized that this was a memory, I had to then go back and revise my understanding of the premise. So using the word memory in that first instance instead of mind would have done a lot for me to ground me in what was happening. But even then, this first paragraph, we have otherwise total blackness. And then the next sentence is the DJ begins. I was like, where did the DJ come from? There was total blackness a second ago. And then we have like I've been here before, and then somewhere I have. And it's like, well, which one is it? And so this is the second story, maybe the third, where we have where the writer is trying to use contradictions to kind of demonstrate character and to keep things interesting, to draw the reader into like investing in the story. And I just don't think that's working. It's kind of like the repetition thing that we talked about last time. It gets overused very quickly. One contradiction can be really interesting, like the eyes in the last story of the little girl, like they were this, now they're this. That's interesting, but if you keep using that same tool, the reader starts to anticipate it and grows weary of it, I think. And so then I almost raised my hand at the end of that first paragraph because of those back and forths, but then tears kiss my cheeks and sweat envelops my arms. The word choice there, kiss and envelop, are like I was saying in the last one, where these start to build out a little bit of what the character is feeling by the word choice that they're using, like envelop, because they're looking for that connection with this person. So I thought that showed some deftness that made me want to go on. But then we get back to the dancers, not the monstrous assemblage, and there's just nothing really happening because this is all in a memory and I didn't know who or why I was there. And like Lesley and Vajra said, I just wasn't grounded in what was happening, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that there's probably a really cool idea here, but take a look at this opening and see if there's a stronger place to drop the reader in.
Good feedback, thank you. Our next submission is entitled Large Benign Polyp, No Reserve, and the genre is horror short story. They sent her home with the polyp in a small plastic jar and a card that read, "Congratulations," in gold block letters. Opening it, she saw the clinic's name printed on one side, hers scrawled across the other, and blue smudges from wet ink on the gloss. She put the jar next to the card on the bedside table, twisted off the top, and dropped in a teaspoon of organic, crunchy peanut butter. She was on a liquid diet, and the smell made her nauseous. The peanut butter stuck to the side of the jar beside the swollen orangey pink blob of tissue. Only the best for her own flesh and blood. As she was closing the lid, the polyp said, "Vanakkam, epadi chukam?" She snatched her hand away and bent to see where the words had come from. No one had spoken in Tamil to her for years, let alone asked how she was. More importantly, there was no opening to make the sound on that round, wrinkly body, only a fat feeder vessel where it had been attached to the lining of her uterus. The end that had been snipped off gave a slight twitch. The polyp was larger than the 1.3 centimeters they had calculated from the ultrasound. She had squinted at the blurry black and white screen as the technician drew measurement lines with the mouse in one hand and pushed on her belly with the cold gel-coated transducer in the other. Vajra, why don't you go first?
I love it. No notes. It's hilarious. It flows really nicely. I nearly laughed out loud when the polyp said "Vanakkam, episo." It's no, it's fascinating, and I think it does a really good job of keeping you moving. There's nice, crunchy sensory details. There's color, there's smells, there's tastes. And without getting bogged down in anything, we're moving. We have stuff has. By the time we get to the end of the first page, we have quite a lot has happened, really, and in a very contained space. I think that's great.
Lesley, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I really am interested to see where this one goes. The only things that maybe I would suggest is I kind of want to know beyond congratulations what is in this card, because she opens it and says the clinic's name and her name. Well, obviously she knows what clinic that she went to, and she knows it's her card because it was given to her. So I don't know, like I'd like to know a little bit more about what is written on this card. Like, is it feeding instructions for this polyp? Because obviously she's feeding it. And the only other suggestion that I would maybe say is that I kind of feel like the last paragraph where it says the polyp was larger than the 1.3 centimeters they'd calculated from the ultrasound, I almost feel like that's in the wrong place. Like maybe that would be better as like the second paragraph rather than down here, because like the thing just spoke to her and she's not sure how it could speak because it doesn't have a mouth. And so you go like the end that had been snipped off gave a slight twitch, and then it's like, oh, well, it's bigger than what it looked like on the ultrasound. And then you describe the ultrasound. Like, I want to stay with the fact that this thing just spoke to her, and then you like tore that away. So that would be my only thing, because I do feel like that paragraph about talking about the ultrasound and the measurements, I do feel like that's really good information. I just think that maybe it's in the wrong place.
Rebecca, how about you?
I love this. Any story that can make me go like, I will love for like the rest of my life. I love like gross, crunchy details like this. And when she dropped the peanut butter in there, I was like, why? I have to know. So I love the details here. And I think Lesley has a point about the description bit being in maybe the wrong place. But on first read, that didn't throw me out at all. I see her point, and maybe on editing, I would have been like, maybe we should move this up. But reading it, I was like, nope, totally makes sense that you'd be, it's bigger than you expected. I did want to point out that I think that sometimes when we first start writing, we're told like, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. And so we're afraid to just tell the reader what the story is about. And the longer I've written and the longer I've read so many stories in Slush, a lot of really good stories just get that housekeeping stuff out of the way at the beginning, like this one does. They sent her home with a polyp and a plastic jar and a card that read congratulations. Boom. You know basically what her problem is, you know where she is, you kind of have an understanding of the kind of world that you're in, because these are words and settings that we're familiar with. And so it just gets that business out of the way, and then we're grounded and we can get on with the story. And so I would say don't be afraid to just, because at the beginning of the story, the reader is open to a little bit of exposition, as long as it's deftly done, right? The reader is not expecting to be immediately hypnotized. They want to be hypnotized, but they know that it takes some time to get to point. And so don't be afraid to do that housekeeping stuff, that character setting, genre, and conflict. Just get that stuff to the reader so they know what's happening, and then you can tell your story. And you don't want to do it heavy-handedly, and it, of course, can be done poorly. But this is an example of way to just drop the reader in and be like, this is what the story is about, go. And I think that this was a really deftly done, and I want to read the rest of it.
And
Fantastic.
speaking about the card, I think that if you had just left it of like, it's this gold, congratulations, and then didn't say that she opened it, I wouldn't have been expecting more information about what's in the card. So if you don't want to give more information about what's in the card, I would just cut out that she opened it. Like like when you said card, I was thinking like a postcard that just said, congratulations, like, here's your polyp, you get to take it home. So you don't have to feel like you need to shoehorn that information in. If you don't want to, you can just take out that she opened it, because like it's it works the other way too, just to be like, here's a congratulations.
I agree. You could just say the clinic sent her home and cut the second sentence. It would work perfectly.
So
yeah.
All right, let's move on. Our next submission is entitled Wasp Season, and the genre is a horror short story. I slid shut the patio door on a waking wasp's nest, burbling like the loose engine block of an upturned car on the day my daughter died. Poison scratched my throat, and wherever I touched the glass, insecticide and sweat transferred legible fingerprints. The instructions on the aerosol suggested allowing 15 minutes for paralysis to set in. I could have left. Came back in the morning, but I developed a bad habit of watching things die. Inside my husband's makeshift museum, floodlights pitched my shadow forward between opposing rows of antique masks. Cross-stitch expressions of sickness, trauma both inherited and lived, and guilt. So much guilt and accusation woven and wrung from raffia and leather. In the den of a suburban split level so brand new it could not be haunted, a pre-diaspora Central African tribe performed its agony silently. I turned my back on it and faced a different civilization, one desperate to be heard. Latched under the awning, a twitching, spiral-sewn paper organ begged me to slip it over my face. Welcome to the trauma factory, I'd whisper in our new voice. This is no place for a child. Too late. I'd signed the forms, passed the psych eval, let a tattooed social worker sit in the chair with the uneven legs, my daughter's there, and tell me how adoption was a selfless act. I'd held my husband's gaze and promised this was what I wanted. Dan loved me best as a mother. And Shayna? She'd always wanted a sister. Rebecca, you made it through. What kept you reading?
Trauma Factory. I saw that coming and I was like, that is an interesting phrase for all of this. I was very, very close. And I will speak to why I was very, very close. But what kept me reading was that these last 3 paragraphs, I think, are much more compelling than the first 2. The first 2 have a lot of what I like, it's like word soup, and I don't want that to hurt the writer's feeling, and I'm sorry, but there's just a lot of words in all of these sentences. And Andrew, you did a great job reading them, because there's a lot of repetitious syllables and stuff too, like waking, wasp's nest, burbling. That first sentence is massive, and in comparison to the last one, this is doing a similar thing where it's trying to, like, you know, character setting, problem, go. But there's so many words and so much going on in this sentence that I think that it risks all of it getting jumbled, and the reader isn't going to know which part of this is important. We want to focus, I think, on the upturned car on the day that the daughter died. Do we really need the loose engine block? Do we need the waking and the nests? Like, could you tighten this to get that, you know, business kind of sentence dropped in without it being quite so much? And then I think that kind of heavy, kind of overwritten description continues. There's a lot of really interesting things here, but I think it would benefit from a serious tightening. Because once we get to Trauma Factory, I was like, oh, this could be a really interesting story. There is some really interesting things at play here. But the descriptions in those first 2 paragraphs are a lot. Bad habit of watching things die is great though. That's a great line that's a really strong character moment. So I love that.
Vajra, how about you?
Yeah, I wanted to be intrigued by that opening sentence, but I also struggled with it because I mean, okay, so her daughter has died in a car accident or something, hence the loose engine block of the upturned car. And the waking wasp's nest is burbling because she's just sprayed it with insecticide. And I get that, but and it took me a minute to put that together. Like, didn't actually put it together until the end of the first paragraph, I think. Um, but and then, like, I feel like you dropped this dead daughter into the story for shock value, and then instantly took us as far away from it as possible. Then we spend a whole paragraph talking about the husband's like makeshift museum and its exhibits, which are frankly not remotely as interesting as either the wasp's nest, which is a great visual, or the daughter's death, which is this big emotional trauma that has been mentioned, and now we're like looking away from it. Like, get that that's what the story is fundamentally about. Clearly, we're building up to coming back to that, but I think we're spending way too much time away from it, and the we did not need the museum, I don't think, with the masks and the guilt and accusation and the the den of the suburban house so brand new it couldn't be haunted. First, technically, that just makes me want to argue with it because, like, no plot of land is immune to being haunted. Like, it
I
doesn't
had that
matter.
thought too.
Yeah, it's not a question of how new your house is. Um, so and these are unnecessary like arguments for your reader to be having in their head, right? Has nothing to do with what's happening in the story. It has nothing to do with the story's core trauma, which is actually interesting. And I feel like we're not being allowed to get at the part of the story that is visibly interesting, which is the trauma factory and the what is happening in this family to these kids. Um, so yeah, I would say like it, there is something here. There's something interesting here, but to me, this would have been like a revision request or something saying, can you please focus the story more on its actual whatever it's actually about rather than and getting it needs to be tightened. As it is, like I have already kind of like drifted. My interest is drifted away by the time you're coming back to what the story is about.
And Lesley, you raised your hand. You were the first judge to raise your hand.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I very nearly raised it after the second sentence because those 2 sentences are there's just so many descriptions and they're so long that I really felt like what was happening was completely lost. But then I didn't when we got, but I developed a bad habit of watching things die because that's very, very interesting. But then in that second paragraph, it went back to these very long descriptive sentences, and I just lost interest at that point. I do feel like there is something incredibly, incredibly interesting here. Because, like, we know the daughter is dead, right? And it says that this is no place, the trauma factory is no place for a child. But you know that they are in the process of adopting a child because her husband likes her as a mother. Like, Dan loved me best as a mother. That is a short sentence. And that sentence says so much about their marriage. Like, that's interesting. But you lost me before I could even get there just because of these overly long, descriptive, clunky sentences that weren't giving us the meat of the story, and they weren't giving us what's interesting about this story. Like, this woman's relationships and her reaction to the death of her daughter and her reaction to how she believes her husband loves her best. That's the interesting part. But it just got lost. And so that's why I raised my hand.
All right. This next submission may be the last one that we get to during today's session. It is entitled The Cobweb Groom, and the genre is a fantasy, a fairy tale, novella. The forest took no men all summer. In open talk, the women of Wick rejoiced, but at night and alone they wept for sheer disquiet. Each dreamed the same dream, tossing in her bed, of a hot whisper threading between the trees, the prick-a-prick of pointed feet, of many eyes gleaming through a bedroom window, and the soft hiss of silk. Only the wives slept soundly. Their husbands were safe, so they regarded the unwed millmaids and Jills with smug sympathy. But all the rest, with no rings on their fingers and no claim to their own menfolk, but a spoken promise, and sometimes less than that, they nibbled their fingernails to the quick whenever they laid aside their axes and saws. The woods was home and mother. They took their livings from her bosom and built houses in the shelter of her encircling shaded arms. But she was just as jealous as she was generous to her children and robbed them often and without mercy. But that evening, Helene felt the woods were full of music. She leaned on her axe handle with the head resting in the dirt, listening to the regular bite of the other timberjills' axes, the hoarse breathing of two long-handed saws working through the mighty timber, the stomp of heavy boots through sawdust and undergrowth, and the songs of her friends as they ferried hard-fought prizes out of the forest to the donkey carts waiting to haul logs to the river mill. Those were some very long sentences to read. I just needed to say that. Lesley, let's start with you.
I would keep reading. I feel like this, I mean, it definitely, if you had not told me that this was fairy tale, I would have known right from the beginning, from the way the language is, from the way you're setting it up, from the descriptions. There are a lot of very, very beautiful descriptions. I really enjoyed how like the wives slept soundly because their husbands were safe. So you're immediately letting us know that being married to a man saves him from whatever fate this is that that is happening in this forest, which is actually really kind of interesting to me because normally it is the women in fairy tales that need to be saved. So I like that little role reversal. I do have to say, and maybe that this is just a silly way that my mind works, but in my mind, I'm kind of going, well, wouldn't that mean that people would rush to get married? Like they could very easily keep their men folks safe just by saying, yes, let's get married. So that kind of was in the back of my mind going, well, if marriage is the way to save them, why aren't more people marrying? Like I would think that would be a side effect, but that's just a weird Lesley thought. I would keep reading. I do kind of want to see, because right now it feels like the danger's kind of vague. We know the forest takes unwed men, but we don't know why and we don't know how. And so I would want to get those answers sooner rather than later. Like I would want to know how it's taking them so that it just becomes clear like what's at stake. Right now it's not super clear how they're taken. Like, are they lured away? Are they happy to go? I mean, that would explain why they're not rushing to get married. If the men are happy to go, then that, but we don't know that yet.
Interesting. Vajra, how about you?
I like this. It's not the kind of thing I usually like. enjoy reading, but it has a um, dark undercurrent which I like. It makes it seem more kind of horror-y than fairy tale to me, and I do like that. And I love Timber Joe. I just love that. I would keep reading just because you said Timber Joe. I like it when people like uh, come up with stuff like that. And I like that I mean it's called the cobweb groom, and we have a whole spidery bit in the opening paragraph. We never actually say spider. I like that. So there is a spider monster in the forest that takes the men, and also I guess the women if they're not married. Something. I don't really follow. I'm not following as Leslie said. I'm not quite following the dynamics of how that works. But this is a novella, so it's fine. I mean, I don't need to understand the full mechanics of the cobweb rooms, lifestyle choices just yet. I can follow along and see where we go with that. Um, um, yeah, I did kind of hiccup a little at the woods was home and mother. I was like, should that mean the woods were home, or are we like uh, because we have it both ways. The woods were, I think, in a separate section somewhere. The woods were full of music, but the woods was home and mother. Is that intentional? Is that just a typo? Is that like a personified woods, which is different uh, from the mother woods, which is different from the regular like landscape woods. Like I couldn't tell if something was happening there, if it was just a typo. So but given that this is a fairy tale fantasy story, it felt like it could be mean something. So I snagged on that. I was wondering, okay, am I missing like something there? But other than that, I mean, I would have kept reading to find out either way. So that works for me.
All right. And Rebecca, what are your thoughts?
I love the title, and I loved that first paragraph. But apparently it was just me, but wives threw me out completely and made me feel like I missed something, because it said the women of Wick and wives tend to be women. And I hadn't realized that those were being distinguished. So I was like, wait, it just said that they had nightmares. What do you mean they slept soundly? And so immediately I was thrown out, and I missed a little bit of what came next, because I was going back up going, wait, what did I miss? So that like apparent contradiction confused me until I figured out what was actually being said. And then by that time we were to the woods was home and mother, which is just kind of fantasy talk. I love fantasy generally. And then we have this but that evening. And I'm not sure why the but. Helene felt the woods were full of music. But why? Why is that an exception to something? What is that in response to? Why is music in relationship to the paragraph beforehand, right? So it feels like it's trying to like lead us into this character, and that's an interesting way to do that, but it leaves me with more questions, because I'm like, but what? Like, but that evening, why? And so it left me just a little bit confused. And so I think maybe some tightening or some clarification, but this is a novella, so a lot of those questions might be, delivered on in coming pages, because this is a slightly longer piece.
All right. I have received the signal that we are just about out of time. I want to thank everyone who submitted. I'm sorry to everyone whose story we couldn't get to today.
And if we did get your story.
Thank you to our wonderful judges who joined us today, and everyone who joined to watch the live stream. We hope everyone found the judges' comments educational and helpful. If you enjoyed what you saw and heard today, be sure to visit us online at apex-magazine.com and follow us on Twitter at apexmag. And if you'd like to support Apex Magazine, please check out our Kickstarter at the link below and share it around to spread the word. I'm today's host and narrator, Andrea Johnson, and we all hope to see all of you again soon at the next Snap Judgment.